Page 260, Part 19. No human being ever needs to be anxious in his or her life about anyone or anything. Consequently, therefore, no human being has to go through life trembling, shaking, and racked with anxieties. Anxiety is nothing more and nothing less than a product of uncertainty about something unknown. But something unknown is not worth being anxious about. Rather, it is worth getting to the bottom of, whereby the truth concerning the unknown is uncovered and recognized. And once the truth pertaining to the unknown has come to light, then it can also be understood and evaluated, whereby cognition gains ground and reveals that there is no need for anxiety when a fact is recognized in all its values. Therefore, it is necessary to recognize and comprehend the truth that no kind of anxiety at all needs to arise when the human being confronts his or her fellow human beings and all the things which he or she encounters and observes, and considers them with open eyes and senses, and thus sees how they actually are. This is the most important point to do with gaining control of one's anxiety, for which reason it must be imprinted into one's memory so that, time after time, it gets into one's thoughts when it is required. One must then work in this kind to overcome the anxiety and to control it, instead of allowing it to control oneself. But overcoming anxiety and controlling it only happens via the intellect, from which the relevant rational steps are taken in the previously mentioned form, being the recognition of the actual facts pertaining to the unknown. And once the anxiety is overcome in this wise and is dissolved, the consciousness and its attitude also thereby change, whereby the thoughts also inevitably change and become more positive. But this change also takes place in the entire body, because as a result of the disappearance of the anxiety, there is a calming of the nerves, which were stirred up and stressed by the anxiety. Nerves created by the anxiety, and as a result of which the body becomes strained and tense. But anxiety also impairs the feelings, and thereby the psyche, whereby purely psychical harm, or also psychosomatic suffering, can appear, which cannot be healed with any medicine other than the might of the thoughts, when they are correctly ordered, and are tended and nurtured in a neutral, positive, equalized form. Anxieties can trigger immense conflicts, which can often only be calmed again and resolved with external psychotherapeutic help. However, for that, the human being's own inner power and the might of his or her thoughts is actually also required, without which no change for the better can be called forth. One must thereby search for the innermost peace which exists deep in the innermost creational nature of the human being. And this peace must be integrated into the inner nature which every human being must acquire himself or herself, and which must be fundamentally formed in accordance with the innermost creational nature. From this inner peace, many further values then arise, such as the inner power by means of which the consciousness is formed, through which the might of the thoughts then also arises, which must be brought to fruition when they are of a neutral, positive, equalized kind. Naturally, it cannot all be found and created at the first attempt, for which reason it all often comprises a long and frustrating search and task. But with sufficient striving, and with the necessary will, a way can quickly be found to allow the first successes to become reality. And once these have occurred, then the further efforts are very much easier, and lead to finally being able to actually resolve and overcome terrible things, which also applies to anxieties, which still cause their mischief in a hidden form. The truthly knowledge and the effective truth can never be replaced by a belief or by purely intellectual interpretations, because the creational truth and the creational natural laws and recommendations are based on purely spiritual values, and therefore not on empty religious phrases and godliness. Trust in, quote, God, and wrong convictions of the same direction, or on pure intellectualism. Utilizing and advocating religious teachings and so forth is therefore absolutely inappropriate, because they only falsify the creational truth and the actual creational laws and recommendations of all spiritual values of creation. Problems thereby in turn arise for the human beings as individuals and in society, because, due to that which is false, all values of the truth and of the real life are suppressed and are steered into paths and interpretations which guide into the unreal, as a result of which the human being increasingly distances himself or herself from the effective creational truth. As a result of a belief, the human being creates a, quote, personal gospel, which he or she follows faithfully and in contempt of the truth, in the hope that one day, quote, God the Father, or, quote, Jesus Christ, and so forth, saves his or her soul from purgatory when the last judgment comes upon him or her. And therefore the human being who is overcome by the belief in a God and the like is of the erroneous opinion that this God is far superior to the human being's consciousness. The, quote, personal gospel thereby quickly changes to a, quote, social gospel, according to which the whole of humanity is dependent on a God and his beneficence or revenge, who therefore also bears the entire responsibility for the individual human being, just as he does for the entire mass of humanity. This is a belief which drives the human being, who is labile and unknowledgeable in terms of consciousness, intelligence, and rationality, as well as thoughts, into the delusion that he himself or she herself bears no kind of responsibility at all in relation to and for his or her entire life, as well as for his or her neighbor's life, because this is, quote, God's business alone. In his or her life, the human being who is unfree in himself or herself carries chains which he or she forged himself or herself, which not only bind him or her, rather they also build up anxiety in him or her link by link. However, the peculiar situation thereby arises whereby the human being simultaneously loves and hates his or her self-chosen imprisonment, and with that also his or her restrictive chains. And exactly this peculiar erroneous assumption of the consciousness explains, at least in part, why it is so difficult for every individual to free himself or herself from his or her anxieties through his or her own initiative, and to actually also be rid of them. But the possibility of getting rid of the anxieties actually exists for every human being. However, the way to the overcoming of anxiety is not easy to go along, but for every individual who is overcome by anxiety, it is worth going along the way and following it. And once the anxiety has disappeared, then the relief quickly becomes intense and overwhelming, indeed almost painful, but the consciousness and its thoughts quite quickly attune themselves to that and create a feeling of indescribable joy. The entire thing works as an extraordinary experience through which inferiority complexes and compulsive thoughts of failure are also annihilated. And if one contemplates this and considers one's fellow human beings, one suddenly recognizes that still many thousands and millions of human beings of a similar kind could be freed from their anxiety if they followed the same way of self-liberation, the way which consists of the simple formula of fathoming the unknown from which the anxiety emerges. As already explained, the normal method for liberation from anxiety is based on fathoming those factors of the unknown which are responsible for the anxiety. However, this fathoming and the resulting outcomes require a long and patient use of the laws of the consciousness. One of these laws is the practice of self-cognition and self-realization. And a further one of these laws is based on self-liberation, which must be used to such a degree that the human being frees himself or herself from all those negative-wrong ideas and habits and so forth which he or she consciously comprehends as a result of self-cognition. In contrast to that, all kinds of the consciously comprehended positive-right factors are to be emphasized and formed into values which can be realized by means of the might of the thoughts. To exercise self-cognition means to recognize one's inner nature, with all its values and unvalues, which every human being creates in himself or herself, and which must either be eradicated or consciously brought to fruition, depending on what kind they are. If the inner nature is formed according to the creational natural laws, then this happens in accord with the form of the creational model, indeed according to the innermost nature, which is creational. Therefore, the forming of the human being's inner and outer nature is in every regard his or her own duty and obligation, and indeed emerging from the creationally conditioned striving for that which is higher. And since the formation of the forms of the human being's own nature relating to the inner and the outer are his or her duty and obligation alone, it is inevitable that he himself or she herself is also able to develop the powers necessary for that, if he or she forms his or her inner nature according to his or her innermost creational nature, to which end it is only necessary to recognize and to follow the striving impulse of the individual factors of the creationally conditioned innermost nature. And in fact, the human being's entire life would be quite useless if he or she did not possess his or her creationally conditioned innermost nature, from which emerge all necessary impulses for the striving for evolution, by means of which he or she is not only able to form his or her inner and outer nature, rather also his or her character, morality, and entire personality, as well as his or her life. And the human being himself or herself is actually innately responsible in every regard for that, because there is no creator God or the like who would take this duty and obligation from the human being, or who could give him or her power and help in order to form and to fulfill all things of life, and all things pertaining to his or her own development. The significance and the sense of a Godhead is based in the human being himself or herself, because aside from himself or herself, there is no divinity who rules over him or her, or who is responsible for his or her very existence. Thus, the human being does not live and evolve by the grace of a creator God, rather solely and in every respect as a result of his or her own efforts. Naturally, the creational natural energy is thereby necessary in order to enliven the material body, so therefore the creational spirit form is necessary, which, however, has no relevance to a creator God. Rather, it is an energy of the impersonal and genderless universal consciousness. Anxiety does not exist in the creation energetic spirit form. Consequently, No anxiety impulses can reach the material consciousness or the inner nature from it. Therefore, if anxiety appears, then it is created in the consciousness and is given expression by the thoughts and feelings. This also applies to the anxiety regarding other human beings. The necessary factor which helps one to lose one's anxiety regarding other human beings concerns one exercising a neutral, positive, equalized, and realistic attitude in regard to the fellow human beings in order to see and recognize them as they actually are. The factor of the unknown is thereby broken up and demystified, which results in the anxiety disappearing. Unfortunately, it is a sad fact that uncountable human beings have anxiety regarding others. Human beings with anxiety regarding their neighbor or fellow human beings are especially those who suffer from shyness, inhibitions, inferiority complexes, and so forth, or who are simply uneducated, unknowing, or are in some form backward or disadvantaged. Such suffering or disadvantages naturally lead to thoughts and feelings which are of a quite negative nature, and consequently, in this form, also influence the psyche and consciousness, such that factors arise from that which are confusing and have become inexplicable, which embody something unknown, which gives cause for the anxiety. Anxiety has nothing to do with fear, because fear is based upon things which are completely different from unknown factors. Fear namely arises as a result of the human being shrinking back from certain and, to him or her, known things, facts, events, and experiences, undertakings, acts, deeds, and thoughts, as well as feelings and manifold other elements and matters, because he or she is shy of, that is to say, fears, the arising or expected consequences, whereby it is to do with consequences which are known, or which can be foreseen. With fear, known factors therefore play a role, while with anxiety, the triggering factor is the unknown. To free oneself from anxiety means to behave in a neutral, positive, equalized way, and in the same form, to get to the bottom of the anxiety-creating unknown in order to recognize it in all its facts, whereby the anxiety dissolves, because the human being is not anxious about that which he or she really knows and understands. Only factors of the unknown trigger anxiety, because the human being does not know how to defend himself or herself against them. However, if he or she knows of a danger or some other thing which brings harm, then normally he or she creates powers in himself or herself in order to counter the terrible things to an appropriate degree and in order to protect himself or herself. He or she only does not do that when he or she is weak and labile. Consequently, he or she is then overcome by fear.